information today, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Supported Decision Making, What It Is and How to Make It Work. We are excited to bring you this webinar during Developmental Disabilities Awareness Month, which seeks to raise awareness about the inclusion of people with developmental disabilities in all facets of community life, as well as awareness of the barriers that people with disabilities still sometimes face in connecting to the communities in which they live. Our presenters today are Tina Campanella and Morgan Whitlatch with Quality Trust for Individuals with Disabilities, Leonard Stevens from Project Action, and Laura Butler with My Choice Kentucky. My name is Kristen Dahl, and on behalf of the Mental Health and Developmental Disabilities National Training Center, I would like to thank you for taking the time to be here today. Please visit our social media and website, mhddcenter.org, for resources related to mental health and developmental disabilities. We have a new module on supported decision-making that we're excited to share with you. We will share the link in the chat box and in our follow-up email. If you are joining us on Zoom, the controls are located at the bottom bar of your Zoom window. Please use the chat box if you have any comments or technical issues, and we will do our best to assist you. Please use the Q&A to submit questions for our presenters. We will read your questions as time allows throughout the presentation. There is a hand raising feature you can use if you need assistance from the MHDD team. Other than those presenting the webinar, everyone is muted and camera access is turned off. The webinar is being live captioned. You can turn on captions in the Zoom window by clicking the CC button on the menu and selecting Show Subtitles. You can also change the size of the caption text by selecting Subtitle Services. ASL interpreting services are being provided by Central Kentucky Interpreter Referral. The webinar is also being live broadcast on YouTube. If you're joining us on YouTube, please add your questions and comments to the live chat on the right-hand side of your screen. The webinar is being recorded and will be available on the MHDD YouTube channel and the MHDD website later this week. We will send out an email tomorrow with the webinar recording and with an evaluation. We ask you to complete the evaluation so we can improve future webinars. The email will also include instructions on how to receive continuing education credits. Once again, thanks for being here. I'm going to turn it over to Laura Butler, who will introduce herself and our presenters. Thanks.
Thanks, Kristen. And thank you all for joining us today. I am Laura Butler, and I work at the Human Development Institute at the University of Kentucky, where I am the director of My Choice Kentucky, which is our supported decision-making project. And when Kristen came to me with the idea of doing a webinar, I immediately suggested Tina Campanella and Morgan Whitlatch, both of whom are leaders nationally in the supported decision-making arena. And I have personally learned a lot from them. Tina and Morgan both work for Quality Trust in Washington, D.C., and we're really honored to have them with us today. We also have with us Leonard Stevens, who is the coordinator of Project Action, and he's going to share some of his experiences with supported decision-making. So we'll go ahead and get started with Tina.
Thanks so much, Laura. So I'm going to go ahead and see if I can share my screen, and I might need your assistance, Brandon, again. To get the slides up. There we go. Wonderful. I think we're in business. Okay, so again, we're pleased to be here. My name is Tina Campanella. I am CEO of Quality Trust for Individuals with Disabilities. Quality Trust is an independent monitoring and advocacy organization based in the District of Columbia. Our definition of advocacy is really helping people solve problems. Some of those problems we identify while we're out doing what we call monitoring and checking up to see how things are going for people. And some of those problems are things that people call us with. And we have been blessed over the past 6-7 years to be a hub for supported decision-making and really host of the National Resource Center on supported decision-making. And our goal with that center has really been to connect and coordinate all of the good information around the country that's happening around supported decision-making. It's been an exciting journey and one in which we hope we'll share a little bit about that with you today. As Laura said, I am joined today by Morgan Whitlatch, who is not only the legal director of Quality Trust, she's also the project director of the National Resource Center and does the lion's share of the work, bridging over between practice and policy around supported decision-making. Leonard Stevens, who has lived experience, which we think is very important to share with you, not only from his own personal experience with supported decision-making, but also from his role in working to support other people with disabilities throughout the District of Columbia. And finally, Laura Butler, who is also an important part of our presentation, because Laura has been a key person in really trying to make supported decision-making spread and work for a number of people throughout the state of Kentucky. So really that was our design and how to make this work and what to present to you today. I'm going to start by some very basic stuff. We're not going to spend a lot of time doing the setup here, but we think it's really important for us to clarify what we mean by supported decision-making. Because, the good news is it's been taking off. The bad news is when people use the term, they don't always mean the same thing. And for us, supported decision-making is just about what people do as part of everyday life in exercising control over their life. And it's very similar, if not exactly the same as what you do in your day-to-day life experience. But for people with disabilities, very often, you can imagine that sometimes they need extra help. And because of that extra help, people are often prone to seeing that decision-making process different. But once again, we believe that no one makes decisions by themselves. So getting access to whatever help you need in order to make decisions, depending on wherever those decisions are, is just a natural part of life. So the help may look different for specific people, or it may be different around specific types of decisions. But most people, when they're faced with especially major life decisions, don't make those decisions in isolation. They do some sort of combination of talking to other people, looking up for other resources, trying to learn more about the situation, and then broadening out, kind of the idea about who they might rely on to help them. So we really are honoring people's as independent, entities as real people by honoring their preferences and acknowledging that every person's decision-making process is different and that every person will take different types and different degrees of control of their decision-making in their life decision-making. But everybody can actually have some control or input into what happens to them. And that has to be the fundamental of what we see as important in decision-making. So that's the kernel of what we see as the idea behind supported decision-making. We think it's really important to describe what it's not. And this is not really anything new. It's something that is caught on, and it's something that people have often contrasted with a more traditional approach that they know to supporting people in decision-making, which is guardianship, which we'll talk a little bit about. I'll introduce, and Morgan will talk a little bit more about it later. But really, supporting people in decision-making has always been something that the folks who intrinsically know how to support people as unique individuals, regardless of the type or severity of disability they have, to live a full and connected life, have done. So it's not a new program. It's not the latest fad or trend, and it's not just a piece of paper that you might execute. And in fact, we'll talk to you today about some of the natural ways in which people can access the same sorts of supports that we do, in order to really shore up their decision-making support system. And most of all, this is not something that you do and then forget. It's really just a natural part of life. So I said it's important to contrast this with guardianship. And on the very highest level, the things that we think are important for people to know, that is when you are doing guardianship, you're really doing something that involves a decision by the court. So, when I talk to families, for example, one of the things that I say is, with supported decision-making, you can figure out how to be involved in the life of your adult child with a disability around their decision-making. However, you'll do it as a kind of a personal decision. You and your family member will make a decision about what kind of involvement, how that'll look, at what times it'll occur, and there won't be any court involvement. If you pursue guardianship, you'll get some of that same authority. However, you also be beholden to the court, because ultimately, while the family or parent may act as the guardian is in fact an agent of the court, and the guardianship ultimately belongs to the court, because it has been the court's decision to limit the person's rights. And then the court decides and controls the degree of support that the person gets. The supported decision-making is a way to create a support system around the person that will do some of the same things as the traditional approach to guardianship has done, but not limit rights and enable the person to retain control over how that support is given, okay? And again, I'm not a lawyer by training. I've really invested my whole life in really supporting people with disabilities on a very practical level. So that's what I bring to this presentation. But we'll talk a little bit about, Morgan will talk a little bit about how that works in practice for actually making things work in a legal sense. So again, as we've said today, we're really going to focus on 4 different things. Those were the basic principles for supporting people, or the general principles, and I'll talk about a little bit more about what supports look like. Then Morgan will take on the legal considerations, and more, Leonard will talk about actually how this works in the lives of real people. And then Laura will take on sort of more about how do you make this work within a state or a jurisdiction, and what are the things you need to think about. So what's on a practical level do we need to think about relative to supported decision-making? The first thing I have to say to you guys is all decisions are not the same. So this whole notion of the fact that we can make an assessment that somebody is or is not a good decision maker is pretty much wrong, because all of us are good at making some decisions and may struggle with making other decisions. And there are a variety of factors that go into determining which ones of those things are either easy or hard for us. So it's no different for people with disabilities. What is different sometimes is the opportunity that people have had to do to make decisions, the opportunity they've had to practice, their involvement in decision-making. And some of those elements are actually the key ingredients for creating a strong and good support system for people. So let's think about, how the process works. What we know about decision-making is that really some of it's science and some of it's really more of an art. Those decisions that we've been making every day over our lifetime are just part of, who we are. We don't even think about them anymore. It's really when we get to a bigger decision that we're challenged to think hard about what is a good process for making decisions. What are the things we need to do? And when we're making decisions on a day-to-day basis, just on a natural, as a natural part of kind of living our life, we're really being guided by the things that are most important to us that also might be called our values, or the things that we've learned over time that might be called part of our culture, you know? So if I grow up in a household where everybody always asks questions and talks everything over, that may be just part of how I make decisions, because that's what I learned to do from the time I was a little child. But if I grew up in another household where nobody talked about anything that was important, that it was just, kept quiet, and you only talked about things when you had to, that might, significantly impact how I approach, another person approaches decision making. So what we see as important and how we've experienced life up until the point that we're challenged with making a decision actually is part of what shapes our approach to decision making. But the bottom line that everybody should keep in mind is decision making is learned. And everyone can learn to be a better decision maker if they're provided the right supports and opportunities. So let's think about what those might be. Again, it's what's in a decision making. First of all, the ingredients is big experience. So we talk a lot when we want people to think about, how you help people develop decision-making skills, especially for people with significant or even slight disabilities. Thinking about integrating this into everything they do from the time kids are small. So even, when kids are small, you begin, as they grow, you begin to give them choices about what they have for snack time, what kinds of activities they engage in for play, what sorts of things that they prefer to learn, and those, what kinds of activities, what kinds of friends they want to have. And you build on those experiences over time, helping people reflect on what worked and what didn't work. And that becomes the basis of people's decision-making skill base. So over time, as that builds up, you then can see people taking greater responsibility and more involved in how those decisions get made. So ultimately, when people can tell you what their preferences are. So here you have, if we can identify where people, feel confident about making decisions, if we know about what's important to people and the things that they want to have guide their decisions, if we can help people to really manage, their emotions and really not let worry or fear, drive things. And if we can help people to figure out who are the people that they feel most comfortable relying on, that's like a sort of a foundation of skills and tools that people can use for decision-making over their lifetime. Obviously, support is critical for people with disabilities. But once again, while there may be some common themes, it won't be one size fits all. So you'll hear me say, and you'll hear Morgan and probably Laura as well, and Leonard, as they talk about supported decision-making throughout the rest of this presentation, emphasize things like opportunity and information and having different choices, things to choose from, as well as thinking about, after you've made a decision, how did that work out? Or figuring out how do you communicate with the people around you about your decision, about what's important to you. And finally, how do you get people really engaged with you directly as the decision maker so that people know that they should come to you. Communication cannot be underestimated relative to support. So many times, people with disabilities who have difficulty with communication have difficulty being seen as in control of their life. If there's one thing I could tell those of you who out there who care about people with disabilities or who are a practitioner here, and that would be key to really helping folks with disabilities get and retain and sustain control of their lives, it's emphasizing communication. We know how people communicate, but making sure that the rest of the world around people that don't spend day to day with them understand those same things that we understand as communication are valid communications could be a key to framing people as as important decision makers and in control of their lives. So, what are the points that you want to take away from this? And I need to go fast here because I don't want to take away time from my key presenters. But really, this is about making sure that we're customizing things and making things work for each person. And that could look very different. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. There are many different things you can do, and it really all comes down to relationship. You can't be a good supporter unless you respect someone and unless you're willing to engage with someone and take direction from them as a partner in the decision making. Because there may be times when you think you have something to offer to help and the person's doesn't want it. And you have to be willing to back off. Clearly, if we have the opportunity to assist people, we should give them lots of access to opportunities to retain and control. And sometimes the best thing we can do is just stand beside them and make sure other people don't talk over them. So those are the basic principles that I think are important for decision making. And I want to be sure to pass it off to Morgan so she can talk to you a little bit about some of the legal considerations, because we have found that sometimes the practical and the legal don't always get blended. And it's really important that those things do. So Morgan, why don't you take it away?
Thank you so much, Tina. Hi, everybody. My name is Morgan Whitlatch. I'm the legal director at Quality Trust for Individuals with Disabilities and the lead project director for the National Resource Center for Supported Decision Making. I am a lawyer by training. I'm licensed to practice law in Maryland and DC. And I really do agree with Tina that I have found like the best approach in thinking about supported decision making is to recognize the blending of interdisciplinary practice in making it truly work on the ground for people. Next slide. So what do we mean when we talk about informed decision making? Okay, so here are some of the core elements: access to relevant information, opportunity to weigh options and consider potential outcomes, and clear communication of a choice and preference. But let's really delve into that to say what that really means. The first element being access to relevant information. I truly believe that access takes time. It depends, how you frame the access question is going to depend upon each and every person you're working with. We need to make the language understandable to the individual person, and that may not just be through oral or written words. For example, I was involved in a situation involving a man with an intellectual disability who made his own healthcare decisions all of his life. But then he was faced with the biggest decision he'd ever faced, whether or not to have heart surgery. And he never faced that before. And the way the family was really able to support him in explaining why it was important to have the surgery was to use a 3D object, namely a faucet. So they would turn the faucet on to represent blood flow through the heart and shut it off to represent the blockage in his heart. And it really resonated with him. I mean, it was just clicked in his brain. All of the words and other kinds of medical mumbo jumbo just didn't connect with him. And so really thinking about how you're making information truly accessible to people, we should challenge ourselves and say, what will it take? Rather than assuming that someone needs to have someone else make the decision for them. The second element of informed decision-making is giving the person the real opportunity to weigh options and consider possible outcomes. So if you do X, then A, B, or C could happen. And what would be the possible results and what would it mean to the individual person? So to provide informed consent, the person has to be supported to weigh those different options. And then the final piece is the person has to be able to clearly communicate out of choice and preference. And when I say communication, that doesn't necessarily mean with words. It could be through gestures, it could be through actions, but it does need to be clear. And Tina talked about the importance of communication. We really have to challenge ourselves sometimes to make sure that we are truly understanding someone and their ability to communicate. Next slide. So what are some of the tools that are out there that have been used to try to promote supported decision-making with some of those, I call them the third parties, the people who might be barriers or barriers to people using supported decision-making, or people who may be used to guardianship or conservatorship being seen as the answer in cases involving people with questionable capacity. The American Bar Association and partners developed a practical tool for lawyers that is designed to kind of be a checklist of sorts for lawyers to fully explore alternatives to guardianship. And it encourages a really close examination of the circumstances of the person. Practical is an acronym for 9 steps to identify decision-making options. And it starts with the idea of presuming guardianship is not needed. That's the P in practical. Then it prompts you to look at the reason, or R, for the concern. What's the problem? What is prompting the concern here? Because there are many different tools in the toolbox to support decision-making, and they all have different kinds of weights associated with them. There are powers of attorney, there's special needs trusts, there's supported decision-making agreements, there's representative payees. So you really want to see what is the concern so that you know what is the right tool that can support the person in that decision-making process. Then you want to ask, so that's the A in practical, you want to ask if the problem is temporary or easily addressable. C is for community. You want to connect people with resources, because frequently that's really what I find what is needed is services and supports, not an alternative decision maker. You want to look at the person's team. That's the T. So has the person already identified people they want to work with? And if they haven't, I is identify. You want to help them kind of build up and identify people that can help them in making those kinds of supports. With C, you want to really look at the challenges. Are there potential problems with resources or supporters? You want to make sure the supporters are trustworthy. You want to make sure that you address those kinds of potential conflicts of interest early on the process. The A is appoint. If the person wants to give someone else the power to support them or make decisions for them, you can support the person in doing that by appointing someone to do that based upon values and preferences. And the L is limit. So as a last resort, you can seek a guardianship that's limited to only those areas where the person cannot make decisions, even with support. So it's a rather tortured acronym, but it's a reminder to all of us that we really need to look carefully at all the different options that are available to people and realize that guardianship is the heaviest tool in that toolbox. It sometimes can be necessary, but we have to recognize, because of the impact it has on people's ability to exercise their own rights, it is the heaviest tool. So you can use this kind of practical checklist in a variety of different kinds of ways, and it has been adapted to, for example, healthcare providers by ABLE South Carolina, but it's a very good reminder to us. Now, if we look to other tools to advance supported decision-making, of course, I'm the lawyer, so I'm going to focus on the paper. But I really hope everybody here realizes that supported decision-making is so much more than paper. It's so much more than law. It is really what happens on the ground with decision-making that makes it the most effectual, but paper can help with enforceability. It can help the doctors listen. It can help the schools listen. So the first one is the power of release of information forms, okay? Frequently, health privacy laws called Hipaa or education privacy laws called FERPA can be used as a weapon against supported decision-making. When the doctor says, I can't talk to you, mom, because your son or daughter is over 18, or I can't talk to you, says the school, you can't be part of the IEP team meeting because your child is over 18. That can all be solved by a very simple release of information form. We've all seen them. And in some jurisdictions, in fact, they've kind of taken a release form, fancied it up, and made it a supported decision-making agreement, because that was really the only barrier to the sharing of information with supporters. So that has been a really powerful kind of tool. And you can have other kinds of written plans too. We have some great examples in supported decision-making guides that are out there that are included on our supporteddecisionmaking.org website. And I've also included a link here. And we're seeing more and more of state statutory supported decision-making agreements. You don't have to pass a supported decision-making law to use supported decision-making because, as I say, we've had the American with Disabilities Act for decades. Supported decision-making should be seen as a reasonable accommodation for a person with a disability. And making assumptions that people with disabilities can't make decisions solely because of a certain kind of diagnosis can be discrimination under the American with Disabilities Act. So I really encourage people not to think that you have to pass a supported decision-making law to use supported decision-making. Next slide. So what about guardianship? As Tina expressed to you, guardianship really is more than a piece of paper. And when I used the term guardianship, I saw a question in one of the chat boxes. I'm using guardianship kind of as a catch-all. Some states call it conservatorship. Some states call it guardianship, and they call the financial decision maker a conservator. So different states use different laws. And that's one thing to kind of factor in when you think about guardianship, is that state laws vary depending upon the state. So it is important to know how your state's laws work, okay? But when we think about guardianship and we think about it being an option of last resort, we should also be thinking of trying to help people and families and providers kind of bust up those myths about guardianship. So guardianship is a legal process, and it requires you to go to court. And parents are not automatically the guardians of their adult children with disabilities. Okay, you have to go to a court process. And as Tina said, it's much more than a piece of paper. It really does mean court oversight going forward. Next slide. But the other thing to remember is how guardians are supposed to be acting. So the National Guardianship Association has said that supported decision-making should not only be considered for the person before guardianship, but it should be incorporated within the process of the guardianship itself. What does that mean? Well, guardians should be involving people in the decision-making process. They should be using standards that recognize a person's ability to be able to exercise their decision-making and practice their decision-making. The National Guardianship Association uses ideas like substituted judgment, where the guardian is supposed to make decisions based upon what the person would want, rather than what the guardian automatically thinks is in their best interest. So I think that's an important thing as part of advocacy, is to really, when there is a guardian, to make sure the guardian is following best practices in the guardianship field. Next slide. The other important piece is to realize that guardianship should not always be considered the final destination. It could be considered a way station. So if something prompted guardianship, like some kind of emergency, and then that emergency is resolved, well, then why is the guardianship necessary anymore? Maybe you should be seeking to have the rights restored for the person. And this is a quote from Robert Dinerstein, who is a professor very highly known within the decision-making right discussion about supported decision-making. And he says, you know, nothing is or should be forever, including guardianship. Guardianship is a powerful decision-making tool, one that may be more powerful than needed. Even if the order appointing a guardian is valid at the time of the initial entry, circumstances can change. Next slide. Now, we are seeing more and more formal recognition of supported decision-making in state laws and in legislatures in the different states. And that's, again, not to say that you require a change in state law to use supported decision-making. It's to say that there is true legitimacy to the concept of supported decision-making. And we're seeing right now, we have had 40 states and DC either introduce or pass legislation. And what you see on this slide is the ones that have introduced are in kind of pale green. The ones that have enacted are in dark green. And the ones that are still pending are hashed. And this is really designed to show a couple of things. One, we're seeing a spread of formal recognition at the state level of supported decision-making. But two, you'll notice that some of the dark green ones also have hashes. And that means that some are passing additional legislation to recognize supported decision-making in other areas of their law. So I really encourage you to visit supporteddecisionmaking.org for more information about these states. Next slide. But the important thing to realize also is that supported decision-making is not being enacted in the state legislatures all in the same way. Just as there's not one way of doing supported decision-making, there's no one way to formalize supported decision-making. We are seeing some states recognize supported decision-making as a less restrictive alternative that the court has to rule out the possibility of before appointing a guardian. And that's in part because of the Uniform Guardianship, Conservatorship, and Other Protective Arrangements Act, which is a model law that is states can look at, and we encourage them to look at, to say, you know, this is how a bunch of experts believe guardianship should work. The American Bar Association has really encouraged the states to consider this uniform law. Other states, as I said, come up with supported decision-making agreement laws, or they do both. They do both the uniform law way and the supported decision-making agreement law way. And that just basically means kind of creating either a form in statute or referencing a form, the possibility of a form that formally documents the supported decision-making arrangement. We're also seeing more states reference supported decision-making in education and healthcare decision-making, like organ transplantation, and more. So people are coming up with creative ways in different states, depending upon what the state's needs are, to formally recognize supported decision-making. The next slide. And these are some other ways that states are recognizing. Some are recognizing them in court orders, with and without statutes. Some are recognizing them through pilot projects. Some are recognizing them through being part of the National Resource Center community of practice. So there are many different ways that we're seeing supported decision-making roll out. Next slide. And we're also seeing a lot more formal recognition here by different federal agencies about supported decision-making. And I don't have time to go through all of these, but I do want to just highlight that the National Council on Disability has really elevated supported decision-making in a legal sense as a federal civil rights issue. And the U.S. Administration for Community Living, which is also sponsoring part of this webinar, I understand, has also been funding a variety of different projects, the most recent one being the Alternatives to Guardianship Youth Resource Center. So I really encourage people to be thinking through and using these resources to legitimize supported decision-making to the naysayers. Next slide.
Morgan, this is Tina. There's three questions here that might be good for you to answer now.
Okay.
One of them is, do you recommend having a supported decision-making release form or release agreement notarized?
Release forms are not required to be notarized, and just generally speaking. So if that is a barrier to using release forms, I would not recommend it for someone, particularly in a time of COVID where it can be really hard to be in front of a notary. But I have to tell you, I've seen notarization smooth the way for the actual use of supported decision-making. Seeing that official seal for third parties can really facilitate the process, but it's not legally required.
The next question is, how would someone build something like a release of information form that allows schools, doctors, et cetera, to share information with the parents of someone over 18? Is it as simple as having the 18-year-old sign a standard form?
It really can be. Now, health decisions are Hipaa forms. So you would want a Hipaa compliant form to use for decision making. So you would want to make sure. So for example, you could have a plan that attaches to it two release forms. One's a Hipaa release form, a standard Hipaa release form that authorizes the flow of information to supporters. And one could be what's called a FERPA form, which is the educational form that you could attach to the plan. They will be different forms. Sometimes some providers are kind of picky about the forms that they have and use. So just ask them for their FERPA form and Hipaa form, and support the person in signing it, so that the person understands that information can be released to their supporters. It can be as easy as that.
Next question is, if someone has a guardian, are we still going through the supported decision-making process, and then the guardian is included in the support?
So I think we have to realize what we're talking about. I think we need to always try to advance the use of supported decision-making principles in guardianship. And I use the word principles because I think you should be encouraging the use of those kinds of principles involving the person in the decision-making process. But there is a difference between supported decision-making and guardianship in a legal sense, in that it's going to be the guardian who's going to have to make the decision based upon the standard they are required to make it by, which in many states is substituted judgment, or the decision the person would want to make. There are a minority of states that focus instead on best interest, but I still think there's a role for a team to advocate for someone to be able to be involved in the decision-making process and give input to the guardian making decisions.
And the last question that we have so far is it possible to still join the national community of practice?
That's a very good question. Right now, the grant has concluded. However, we continue to provide technical assistance and run the National Resource Center. So while we're not having the same kinds of regular calls with the community practices we have in the past, we do serve as a hub in connecting people with others in other states who are interested in learning about supported decision-making.
Well, thank you, Morgan, for that perspective. My name is Leonard Stevens, and I'm the coordinator for Project Action, as well as a peer support specialist for DDAS in Washington, D.C. And this is my first time doing this especially during Disability Awareness Month. Next slide.
Sorry, Leonard, I'm having trouble with this. And we thought, Leonard, the picture of you would be the best part, since it's really your opinion that we want to hear about. And I think that it might be good to start by helping people understand a little bit about your actual role with Project Action and with the Department of Disability Services. So can you tell them a little bit more about what you do for Project Action?
Well, that's a good question. I help specialized people with disabilities, and I'm the advisor. I help the group members with the meetings, and as well as the services they needed. Because let me say this, I've been in everyone's shoes before when it comes to supported decision-making.
Got it. So for you, what does supported decision-making mean? When you hear that term, what do you think about?
The first thing I think about is just independence.
Uh-huh.
And trying to build one for myself and advocating for myself and not rely on anyone else.
Got it. And how does it work for you? Who do you look to for assistance if you need it?
That would be my grandmother or peer support specialist.
Mm-hmm. So if the peer support specialist, who is that kind of a person?
It's either Leanne or my grandmother.
I see. So it's a family member or somebody you work with? Is that it?
Yeah, even my grandmother's members for the church as well.
Ah, okay. And what is it that these people do that you like and that makes their support work for you?
I could say it makes make the right decisions for myself and what's best for me and what's best for them.
Got it.
That's the only perspective I can think of.
Yeah, that's fine. And are there things that people have tried to do to help you in the past that haven't worked very well?
That's a long story, but I'm going to discuss that for another time.
Oh, can't you tell us a little bit about it?
Okay, yes. I'm going to say based on trying to find employment and trying to update my IEP, and that has been the issue, not just during my childhood, but also to my adulthood as well.
Got it. Got it. So is there anything else you can think about that you think, based on your experience or you've seen the experience of other people, that you would advise people not to do if they want to be helpful to people around decision making?
I'm going to say try to surround yourself with the ones that you can trust these days, because my old saying, the best decision may be the right one, but some of the decisions may be the wrong one that can harm you in the long run.
Got it. And so having somebody that you trust to talk things through is really a key element for you. And people that you can't trust are things to be avoided.
Exactly, yes.
Okay, so we've got a lot of people on this call that do this work every day. Is there anything else that you can think about that you would advise them, so to think about in their work? What would you tell professionals that you think is very important for them to do if they want to be most helpful?
I'm going to say this. Put yourself in my shoes for just 1 second and understand how much of the platitudes I had to deal with to get where I'm at right now. And that is based on trying to make the right decisions for you, because some of the decisions may not be good and change may not be good, but the bottom line is this. It could be beneficial for you at the end of the day, because I've been shunned by many people. It's from RSA to even colleges, because I have to deal with this for almost over a decade now, if not maybe long since I was an infant.
Got it. So you can really tell when people are not really even trying to understand who you are.
Correct.
Right. And so your advice would be always try and put yourselves in your place and imagine how it feels, and then to try and maybe even listen to you express those things as a guide.
Yes,
is that right?
Exactly. That's the only message I try to convey.
Wonderful. Good. All right. Morgan, do you have any other questions that you would ask, or Laura?
No, I think that was great.
Yeah, no, it was wonderful.
I heard a lot of good things. One was, that this happens early. I mean, this happens, decision-making and these exposures to decision-making happen when you're a kid, when you're working on your IEP, and how you treat somebody really does matter and affects how people feel about themselves. And I think that is a very powerful message for everybody to hear.
I agree. Leonard, you did a great job. Thanks for sharing so much.
Oh, you're welcome. My pleasure.
Okay, Laura, it's all yours.
Okay, great. So my name is Laura Butler. Like I said, I'm the project director of the supported decision making in Kentucky, which is called My Choice Kentucky. And I did see one question in the Q&A that I wanted to address, and Morgan and Tina and Leonard might have thoughts on this as well, but it's a question that we get a lot, and is it a conflict of interest for a paid supporter to be a supported decision maker? So opinions differ on this. Different people I've talked to. For our project at My Choice Kentucky, we made the decision that paid supporters could be part of the supported decision-making team, if it's someone that knows that person well and that person trusts and wants them to be part of their team. And we made that conscious decision because we work with a lot of people who don't have a lot of other people in their lives who aren't paid supporters. And a lot of those paid supporters are very important to those people, and they are people who they go to for advice and help. So we made that decision to have paid supporters be part of the team if that's what the person wants. Morgan and Tina might have different thoughts on that.
I think that this has created some debate, quite a bit of debate across the United States about paid supports versus unpaid supports. And there are some advocates who truly believe that being a paid supporter and making supported decision-making kind of like a service could really corrupt it in a real way associated with conflict of interest. Others are really concerned about leaving people behind who don't have the quote unquote natural supports to be able to support them. Others kind of have come up with a kind of in-between ground to say we acknowledge that certain paid supporters have conflicts of interest, and it's about managing those conflicts of interest in a way that is open, in a way that really respects the informed consent of the person. So the person who's being supported needs to understand that conflict, what to do if it gets to a point or a decision where that conflict would be paramount, and really plan for how to address in a proactive way the potential conflicts that come up. So that's what I will say. I think there's still a lot of debate going on.
Yeah, and I would just echo, I think you both summarized it beautifully. And, it's not optimal, but I think given the diversity of people who need support out there, it is sometimes might be necessary, and there's some work to do in order to make it work.
Okay, thanks. And I will also just say that keep your good questions coming, and if someone sees something that I don't see, please throw it out there. I'm willing to stay after if other people are willing to, and I think the other panelists did as well. So if you still have questions that we haven't gotten to in our hours up, we're happy to stay and answer them.
Absolutely, we will, Laura, and I'll watch it for you, okay? So you can focus on your presentation.
Okay, so I'm just going to talk quickly about kind of getting a project started around supported decision making. So for me, it was kind of an accident. I was at the AEIDD conference, and it happened to be in Louisville, Kentucky in 2015, which is where I live. And I went to a session because they were going to be talking about national coordinators data, and that's another project I work on. So I went to the presentation, and it turned out that there were people talking about supported decision making there as well. And that really interested me. And I came back to some of my friends and partners, particularly a friend at our state protection advocacy agency, and said, if you heard about supported decision making, we need to do this. This is really neat. This is something that we need. And then it kind of went from there. So next slide. So we didn't have a way to pay for our project. So at the Human Development Institute, we have an internal fund to provide support for projects just like this that are interesting and fit within our mission, but there isn't funding for. So we were able to get money for that and start our small project. So next slide. So we started with our partners at Kentucky Protection and Advocacy, and we did also partner with Jonathan Martinez, who was with the National Resource Center on Supported Decision Making at the time. So our goal was just to kind of get the word out there that supported decision making is a thing, and get people talking about it and thinking about it. Within a month, I think a few weeks actually, of getting the funding for the project, I was invited to a national supported decision making symposium, and got really overwhelmed by so many things that are happening and could happen and need to happen around supported decision making, that I kind of needed to be talked down and say, it's okay, just start small, do what you can, and it's going to be fine. And it was. So then our one-year funding ended. So we weren't sure what to do. We still didn't have any other funding. So we did end up dipping back into the well of the Fund for Excellence at the Human Development Institute. So we did expand our mission a little bit for this one. We were going to keep spreading the word, but also really get more of a practical start of working directly with people who who wanted to use supported decision making, and work with some people to help get their rights restored. So that went really well. And then you can go to the next slide. And then, yeah, so we were able to have our first case in the court that argued supported decision making for a person who was looking to have their rights restored. And that is Susie, who you see in the middle in this picture here, and she's with her attorney, and I believe it's her case manager. So this was in July 2017, about 2 years after we had gotten started with just the idea of supported decision making. So it was really exciting, and we say justice for Susie because justice for Jenny was a big rallying cry for us. Jenny Hatch, who was the seminal supported decision-making case. So next slide. So as our funding was ending this round, the state and national conversations were really speeding up around supported decision-making. If you went to national conferences that related to disability at all, there was usually a session about supported decision-making. Lots of people were talking about it. Lots of you know, tools were starting to come out around that time, but our funding was ending. We weren't going to be able to continue our project. So it ended up that the Commonwealth Council on Developmental Disabilities was able to fund our project, and are still currently funding our project. So we were able to expand it some more. You can go to the next slide. So it was the new My Choice Kentucky, and we got a snazzy logo and just expanded the efforts that we were doing. So more education, more representation for people who were looking to have their rights restored, creating some materials for people to have that were specific to Kentucky, sharing some stories of people who we worked with who have had their rights restored or use supported decision making in other ways. If you go to the next slide, I think, yeah, so here's a few of the things that we did. We created a supported decision making resource guide that is specific to Kentucky and referencing Kentucky laws and things like that, but it has a lot of general information about supported decision making as well. And then we did, so far we've done 3 videos for 3 of the people that we've worked with on our project. So we have a person who's used supported decision making to have his rights restored, a person who's used supported decision making to avoid guardianship, and then the supporter of a person who used to be in guardianship. So we've had a lot of funders and collaborators and partners throughout our journey, and we hope for this list to just grow. And I'm not going to read them all there, but it's just your national organizations, state organizations, local organizations, a lot of individuals too have really helped in this. So the partnership is really valuable, I think, for us and for anyone looking to have a project like this. Next slide. So some lessons learned. As you've seen here, you have to talk about guardianship when you talk about supported decision making. And the thing about guardianship is, and it's been mentioned a couple times, is that guardianship laws are very state specific. So you have to know your own state's law to be able to talk about it and work within that framework. Kentucky statute actually is supportive of the use of supported decision making within a guardianship. The issue is the practice tends to be different than the way the law is written. Next slide. Like I talked about, good partners are essential. Each of our partners has brought something different to the table. And each has been invaluable. Some have been more deeply involved than others, but each of them brings something different to the table. And something that's not represented there is all of the individuals we've worked with, whether it's people with disabilities who've come to us with their stories or let us be part of their supported decision-making journey. We have family members, other supporters who have been really involved as well. All right, next slide. So you have to get institutional buy-in. That can be the court system, school systems, whatever system. You know, we really have to talk to those people and get them to understand what you're doing and why. Don't just race into doing the really big things first. Don't, you know, make the very first thing you do be going to the courtroom to get someone's guardianship removed, or take a bill to the legislature. It's better to do it right than to do it fast. And that's for the individuals, whether they're talking about policy, legislator, what legislation, whatever. All right, next slide. Okay, I did it. It's exactly 3 o'clock.
You did. And we are going to stay on, folks, and answer the questions that have already been entered into the chat box, and I'll do it collectively with Laura, Leonard, and Morgan. But I did want to say, for those who do need to sign off fairly quickly, that to reinforce what Morgan said, we do have state-by-state resources on the National Resource Center website. So please visit that and find out what you can learn about what's going on in your state. We've also, and these slides will be shared, giving you our personal. So this is Morgan and I for Quality Trust, and we have Laura and Leonard for their respective organizations. So we recognize that an hour just allows us to kind of define the landscape, and there may be questions, and we're all happy to talk about more of this issue, because we recognize it's not as easy as it looks to just make it happen. So one of the questions that came in says, if a provider is asked for a signed ROI to be supplied to them to allow information to be shared with a supporter, is there a resource which provides a simple release of information form that can be used in situations where a provider is not able to provide the correct form? That's probably an important question.
There are lots of samples that are online of HIPAA release forms that follow the federal law. My one caution there is that a lot of states have their own, also in addition to the federal health of information law that works there for privacy, some states have their own state law that also covers certain kinds of privacy concerns. So for example, in DC, we have a Mental Health Information Act that is actually more restrictive than the HIPAA law. So it really, you need to go to your, state, some kind of state agency to try to find out what the sample form is in your state. That's what I usually advise people to do. I think the Protection and Advocacy System Network can be a very useful tool there, because they use release forms all the time. And so they know what their current law is.
Yeah, and I would just add to what Morgan said, which is absolutely right on target, that as a non-legal advocate, especially when you hear from people that it's not the correct form and that you need something else, just to push back as hard as you can in a respectful way, obviously, but really to say, help me understand why this is not adequate, especially if you think you've covered the bases. Because a lot of times what we see is institutions are just risk averse, and they really don't have good rationale behind why they refuse to accept something from you or a person with a disability. But if they sound authoritative and they don't get challenged, they just move on. So they don't always have the law behind them. Or a good rationale behind them. And so you might need to just push forward. Okay, where am I? what is the best way to handle a situation where a provider is not honoring an SDM agreement for an individual?
I can start off, but I'm sure Laura and Tina have other ideas as well. I don't think there's one best way, because it depends upon why the provider's not honoring a supported decision-making agreement form. Is it because they think the state hasn't passed a supported decision-making law, so they don't have to comply with the form? Well, then I think you, as a lawyer, my legal perspective is you turn towards, this is an accommodation for their disability. This is a requirement of you, provider, who is a public accommodation. You have to honor it as a reasonable accommodation for the person's disability. That would be the strategy I would take in those situations. It could be because proper forms haven't been submitted. So if the person has created a supported decision-making plan, but it doesn't include a Hipaa form or a FERPA form, the provider's stuck, because we're talking about federal law here, as well as implications of state privacy health laws. So I think the real question, that answer is find out why. If it's because the provider is just assuming a person can't make decisions with support, I think you fall off on, typical kind of requests for reasonable accommodations and reasonableness. I find sometimes by just having a conversation with someone to educate them about what we're really talking about here, it can go a long way. Laura, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree. And we've had these situations with our project as well. And yeah, I think getting everybody in the room together, just to get everybody on the same page, can be really valuable. And then hearing it from the person, what they want and what their choices are. And we've helped people explain that in different ways. They've used vision boards, which is what Susie had in her picture, and just, lots of different ways, but just finding a way for the person to communicate those choices with a person and letting them know that that person has support can be valuable. And hopefully it won't go beyond that. But then the person should also have the right to choose the people who are working with them as well.
You ladies did a lovely job of that. So I'm going to move on to the next question, which is, what if the client agrees, but probably doesn't understand that they're their own guardian?
So I read that question a little differently, Tina. I think it was saying, what if the person agrees, but the writer doesn't really think they understand, but the person is their own guardian.
I think you're right, Morgan. Yeah.
I think, well, I'm going to answer from my perspective on this, and then I really do encourage Laura and Tina to pipe up about this too. I think when you're saying probably doesn't really understand, I think you have to kind of challenge yourself a little bit and say, why don't I think they understand? The person has to be able to provide informed consent, but instead of thinking, oh, I don't think they understand, you really need to have reasons for why you don't think they understand. And then I think you need to kind of challenge yourself to say, well, how can I help them understand? Because if they're their own guardian, you really are supposed to presume capacity in these kinds of situations. I know it can be a challenge. I sometimes I challenge my own self in this too, when I try to make these kinds of determinations, but that would be my kind of perspective, really inquire within a little bit before assuming they can't make informed consent.
Right. And I think, Morgan, the thing you said about really challenging yourself to test out their understanding and try a variety of ways to engage the person around the topic is really the critical one there, because, anytime we talk to a person just one time, we may come away with an impression that they may or may not understand. I'm reminded of, I helped both my mom and dad at the end of their life. And I can think of lots of healthcare situations where a doctor had a conversation with them and they may have said yes or no, but they didn't really understand what the doctor said. And it was because the doctor didn't engage them in an ongoing conversation, didn't ask good questions, didn't really probe for them, whether or not they understood, and explain things a couple different ways. So this is not something that's limited to people with disabilities. It may be influenced by a variety of different factors, including whether or not the person themselves, whoever they are, feels comfortable really, expressing or asking for more information from the person who's providing it. So how did you go about finding a case to restore rights? Any parameters? And what supports did Susie have?
Oh, okay. So Susie just kind of came to us. She was involved with Kentucky Protection Advocacy about something else. And she had filed a petition before we really started working with her to have her rights restored. And the judge was basically going to throw out the case, and someone from Protection Advocacy was in the courtroom and asked for an attorney to be appointed to her, and she was. And we explained to the attorney how supported decision-making was used for Susie, how she was already using it. And the attorney went back, I think a month later, in front of the same judge and explained how Susie gets support. And Susie was able to get her rights fully restored. And in Kentucky, we have a very extensive state guardianship system. And Susie was part of that. So she had a state guardian who had a number of other, dozens of other people that she was guardian for. So that was something that the attorney argued, that Susie was getting supports from other people, not necessarily her guardian, and that she didn't need the guardian to make those decisions. And Susie was one of, this goes back to the question about paid supporters. Most of Susie's supporters were and are paid supporters, because those are the people that are in her life. She didn't have a lot of family members. So that's where and she has most of the same supporters in her life now. That was, a few years ago, and most of the supporters are the same. So we're different. Most of them are the same, but people come in and out of our lives all the time. So I don't think that's anything specific to Susie. So yeah, that's just kind of how we found Susie. We have recruited some other people early on, but recently people now know about us and hear about us from other people, and so they contact us when they have cases with rights restoration or just want to get started with supported decision making.
Next question is, from a medical standpoint, the doctor's orders are not carried out because the client refuses several times. Then Medicaid or Medicare audits and cites the facility. How should refusal decisions be supported but still follow medical orders? So I'm going to take the first stab at this because I do have a background working with Medicaid in particular and monitoring and those sorts of things. And I do think this question relates back to what we talked about before in terms of making sure when people refuse that they're understanding what they're refusing, that they're understanding the potential consequences, that they've been offered options, that there's a good support for them to communicate back to the doctor if the person is unhappy with the doctor's orders. We've had people who have refused to take some of their psych medications because of the way it makes them feel, but they don't have good support when they're at the doctor to tell the doctor why they don't want to take the medication. And so that really, all of those things and continued support for the person to evaluate in a respectful way and change their mind potentially going forward, depending on what the doctor's order is and what the potential consequences of refusing that doctor's order on an ongoing basis, is all the foundation for then presenting to the person who's trying to enforce the regulation around doctor's orders and personal autonomy to really make your case to them. It's not an easy one, and sometimes regulators are not good at weighing all of that information together. But it's not as simple as the person just simply refusing. Again, I can think of a situation where we had someone who refused to take their thyroid medication because of what they perceived as the potential side effects of taking that medication that were incompatible with something that the person wanted. So on one hand, we had to support the person by respecting their decision, but making sure they had the information and making sure the door was always open in the most respectful way without nagging them or making them feel bad about not having followed the doctor's order about to change their mind. And, you know, rightly so, the provider was worried that the refusal to follow through with taking the doctor's orders was going to have a really potentially bad outcome health-wise for the person. But in this situation, I use this story because in this situation, the signs and symptoms of what the people were seeing that they were attributing to the person not taking the thyroid medication actually were related to a totally different diagnosis that had been missed, that got cured, and the person, once they were treated for this other condition, got better, continued to refuse the thyroid medication, and died of something else ultimately. So the complications here could be significant, and it is our job to sort of kind of wind our way through them the best we can while holding true to the principles. That's why we emphasize the principles, because it's the principles that will get you through. Morgan or Laura, do you have anything to add to that one?
Oh, I thought that was thorough.
Good.
Yep.
Okay, we have another question that says, I'm a parent of a child with an intellectual disability with an extensive list of medical issues. Spoke to an attorney in New Jersey who advised that guardianship can be in place, but it does not have to be used unless a very bad decision is being made by the disabled person. Also, if a person is being taken advantage of, unless someone has a guardianship that can intervene to get them away from the person who's causing them harm. Also, if a person is being taken advantage of, unless someone has a guardianship, can they intervene to get the person away from the person who's causing them harm? So did you get that, Morgan? It's a two-part question.
I did. It's a two-part question. So the first part of it is that it is true that there are many guardians who are very supportive of a person. There's some guardians I know who are very supportive of a person making their own decision when they are within the guardianship. But you have to remember, it's still the guardian who's signing on the dotted line. So the guardian is still acting for the person and is recognized as having a legal authority. It's not just that they're the backup person who's governing consent for that first question. So guardians can be very supportive and should be supportive of people engaging in the decision-making process. However, under the law, it's really the guardian who's making the decision for the person. For the second question, I think it's really important to remember that there are no studies that have been done to show that people under guardianship are somehow more safer than people without guardianship. People with disabilities are at risk of abuse regardless of what kind of tool is to use to support decision making. And I think it's about trying to incorporate into their lives certain kinds of safeguards. So you know, I think about situations where you can help the person if someone's being abused. You can help the person get a protective order. You can do all of these other kinds of things. It's not as though having a guardianship is going to stop somebody from always being taken advantage of. And so I think that's an important piece. So you want to say, what is the problem here? Are they being potentially financially abused? Are there other kinds of issues? You know, and really see if it's the guardianship that's the answer to the problem, because there's a lot of ways short of guardianship to support people with disabilities in being protected and not taken advantage of.
Yeah, and we tend to look at this just the opposite way than that attorney advised you. We say you can try lesser restrictive, and then if it's necessary, go to the more restrictive over time if the less restrictive doesn't work. And the other thing that I think I would just add to what Morgan said is that the most recent data that's coming out has actually indicated that people who have greater confidence around decision-making, who feel more control in their lives and who have a better support network are actually less likely to be victims and be taken advantage of by others. They're more likely to go to people on their own for support when they need it, because that's the process of supported decision-making, is that the person is acknowledged as a decision maker and they're really choosing who it is they go to for support. They've thought through, if I have trouble with relationships, or if I have trouble with my health, or if I have trouble with my money, who do I rely on? And those people have been identified. And so they're more likely to go to those people because they know they'll get support and not be controlled. So it's really kind of counterintuitive sometimes for people to think about this. But by going under guardianship, we're actually preventing people from actively engaging and learning the kinds of skills that will keep them safer over time. Laura, did you?
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is that, at least in Kentucky, what people often don't realize is that once you go to court and get guardianship, that guardianship is under the control of the court. So there's a guardian appointed, but what happens within that guardianship is in the hands of the court, including who the guardian is.
So this next one's for you too, Laura. It's, did Kentucky look to a particular state in developing their approach to SDM? And if so, which one and why?
We didn't look at a particular state. We talked to national experts. We read all the materials we could find. We did talk to several states and really tried to put together a best practice sort of model, and just taking things that were working well in different places and trying to put them all together. So we read everything we could. We attended every session we could, any webinar, everything. And still do. That's another big lesson is never stop learning. I love listening to people talk about supported decision making and enjoy hearing how different presenters frame it. So, you know, just hearing what everyone else is doing and finding best practice, and then figuring out what works best in your state and for the people that you're working with.
And I can't underline that enough, Laura. It's not, there's not one, this is a kind of emerging concept. So you need to try things out and test models, and what will work in one state may not work in another state. And so I think really thinking really creatively and critically about how your own processes within your own state works is really important.
Okay, Morgan, I think you're going to, what?
We have 8 more minutes. We have to cut off at 3:30, but does this differ when you're providing this service for older adults? It differs by person. So yes, it will differ depending upon the older adult. When we talk about questions of rather, in the developmental disability world, we frequently talk about building capacity. And in the elder kind of justice world, we talk about diminishing capacity. And so there are certain factors you have to consider that may be different for someone who does have, for example, dementia, memory loss, or age-related disabilities. It's about really trying to be promoting advanced planning, to use supported decision-making, because there have been studies that have shown that people who are older involved in their decision-making are going to be able to maintain in a way better their capacity over time. But it's also about using those moments as we have kind of, early diagnosis of dementia, and we have more time to do advanced planning, to plan for that event in which someone might not be able to communicate a decision anymore. And if someone has been using supported decision-making with an older adult, up till then, they will be really informed of what that person's practices are, what their history of decision-making is, what they value in their life, and they'll be able to continue on under, for example, an agent type of relationship for a power of attorney in a way that kind of includes supported decision-making principles. So, I encourage you to take a look at supporteddecisionmaking.org to read about a case involving a woman who was the first senior in DC to have a guardianship terminated in favor of supported decision-making.
So what do you do, or where do you turn if the individual does not have natural supports that they could use for supported decision-making?
So the first thing I say, it says here supported decision makers, and I think it's important to remember that the supporter doesn't make the decision for the person. It's not a decision maker, it's more a supporter. It's the person who makes the decision. But your point is really well taken. What do you do when someone doesn't have natural supports? I think you have situations like Susie's, right? Where she, she had to rely upon paid supports. And how did you navigate that, Laura, when it had to do with paid supports?
Yeah, we have a number of people in that situation, and it's really about finding the people who the decision maker knows and trusts. And, we, especially with Susie, we talked a lot with those people to make sure that they really were people that were deeply involved in Susie's life, because paid supporters can be those people. And another thing we talk about a lot, especially with students who are coming out of school, but other people as well, is finding ways to grow that circle, to get people involved in the community and in different groups, to find more people that can be in their lives.
That's really important too. And that, like, for example, for the case we worked on for an older adult, what she really needed help was she needed service and support. She needed help budgeting. And so we got her enrolled in a program that she wanted to be part of that could help her with budgeting. So you also need to kind of be examining, when you're having someone without natural supports, what services and supports can we link them into in doing that?
So I've had families question whether or not they need to wait to develop an agreement until after age 18, thinking if the young adult signed prior to 18, it would invalidate the agreement. Is this a consideration we should be making?
So until somebody reaches the age of majority, they can't sign kind of contracts or formal agreements, but that doesn't mean you can't engage in planning that promotes supported decision-making beginning in pre-K. For example, you could incorporate into IEPs goals about decision-making that really focus on trying to build the capacity of the young person over time, rather than treating the transfer of rights when they turn 18 as some kind of cliff where now they have to be, for the first time, kind of exposed to making decisions. So I think while it may be different in actually signing a document, planning can still occur, and documents can still be supporting a young person's growth into being a decision maker that's been exposed to having choices, been exposed to kind of a varying diet of different choices that become more and more complicated over time, so that they can really build their capacity.
This last one, I think, is for you, Laura. Have your services been sought by long-term care residents in Kentucky?
We have not worked with long-term care residents for My Choice Kentucky. That is an area that we would like to expand into. We're still a really small project, so that area, working with older adults and really focusing in on students who are getting ready to transition out of high school or who are turning 18 are some of the big focuses that we're wanting to transition to right now.
Yeah, I would say that, just to let people know who are still on the call, that the National Resource Center was funded by, again, the Administration on Community Living. And while we made way more progress with adults who had developmental disabilities, our focus was both on folks who were aging and the use of supported decision-making in the group of folks who are aging, as well as people with disabilities. So that's why Morgan referred you to sort of that place to find some more resources for use of supported decision-making as people age.
Yeah, and we were also involved in our Kentucky wings, working at interdisciplinary network of guardianship stakeholders. We were involved in that, and there were a lot of folks involved with elder care in that wings group. So that also got the word out to them a little bit.
Yeah. So I think that's it. Kristen, I think it's yours.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that you were able to stay and ask questions. We had lots of activity and lots of questions, and we will send out the questions tomorrow with the recording as well as the resources and slides. So thank you so much for being here today. Have a great afternoon, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye.